On a rainy Friday evening, two police officers were out on a quiet street, doing their regular patrol. They were looking for anything suspicious because there had been reports of stolen cars in the area. The street was almost empty, and most people were already home. Suddenly, the officers spotted a black car that seemed out of place. It looked like one of the vehicles reported stolen just a few hours ago. They exchanged glances and decided to pull the car over, thinking it was their big chance to catch a car thief. Inside the car, a woman was driving home from a long day at work. She worked for the FBI and had only recently moved to this town. She was tired, but felt relieved to be heading home at last. As she approached a red light, she noticed flashing police lights in her rear-view mirror. At first, she thought the officers would speed past her, but then she realized they were signaling her to pull over. Surprised and a bit confused, she carefully pulled to the side of the road, wondering why she'd been stopped. When the officers approached her car, she rolled down her window and calmly showed them her FBI badge, explaining that she was a federal agent. But the officers didn't seem convinced. They looked at each other with doubt in their eyes, and one of them spoke up, questioning if her badge was real. This was the last thing the woman expected. She had dealt with situations like this before, but never thought her credentials would be questioned so bluntly. She kept her voice steady and suggested they run her license plate number in their system to confirm her identity. Instead of doing what she suggested, the officers continued to question her and even asked her to step out of the car. By now, the woman was frustrated but stayed composed. She knew arguing wouldn't help. She reluctantly got out of the car, hoping this misunderstanding would be cleared up soon. However, as she stood outside in the rain, she realized the officers still weren't convinced. They called for backup, making her feel like she was being treated as a suspect instead of a fellow law enforcement officer. Minutes later, another police car arrived, and a senior officer stepped out. He quickly assessed the scene and approached her, taking a closer look at her badge and the tense expressions on the faces of the younger officers. It didn't take long for him to recognize her credentials. His face shifted from confusion to understanding as he realized a big mistake had been made. The senior officer turned to the other officers and, in a calm but firm voice, told them to step back. He then apologized to the woman, explaining that there had been a mix-up and that the officers had acted hastily. While she was relieved that someone finally understood who she was, she couldn't shake the frustration of how the situation had escalated. She wondered why the officers hadn't just checked her license plate from the start instead of letting their suspicions get the better of them. The senior officer gave the younger officers a few words of advice, reminding them of the importance of verifying details before making assumptions. The woman listened, nodding in agreement, but she knew this experience had highlighted a larger issue, one that she felt needed to be addressed so that no other officer, federal or otherwise, would have to go through the same experience. The woman stood there in the rain, feeling a mix of relief and frustration after the senior officer recognized her as an FBI agent. She was finally able to relax a bit, but the whole experience left a strange feeling in her gut. She wasn't used to being doubted in this way, especially by fellow law enforcement. She had expected them to be cautious, yes, but not to question her so aggressively when she had shown them her badge right away. The senior officer took the younger officers aside and spoke to them quietly, out of her earshot. She could see their faces. They looked both embarrassed and defensive. The senior officer's words were calm but firm, and he occasionally gestured in her direction, as if to remind them of who she was and a mistake they'd made. She understood they were young and likely new to the job, but she couldn't ignore the way they had treated her. They hadn't even tried to run her license plate or verify her badge through a quick call. Instead, they'd let their own assumptions take control. After a few minutes, the senior officer returned to her with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," he said sincerely. "They were just trying to be thorough, but I see how things could have been handled better. Please know we're working on training to avoid situations like this in the future." The woman appreciated his apology. She could see he was genuine and understood her frustration. But deep down, she also knew this wasn't just a small mistake. It was an example of what could go wrong when officers acted without all the facts. She nodded, accepting his apology, but she couldn't help but feel that this was a lesson everyone needed to learn from. As she got back into her car, she thought about what had happened and the impact it could have on how different agencies work together. Later, as she drove home, she kept replaying the incident in her mind. She couldn't let go of the thought that if this had happened to her, a federal agent, then what about ordinary people who might find themselves in similar situations? They might not have the badge or authority to prove who they are, and things could escalate even more quickly for them. This experience was frustrating for her, but it also made her think about the bigger picture. Over the next few days, she couldn't shake the incident from her mind. She decided to file a report, not out of anger, but with the hope that it would lead to better communication and respect between local police and federal agents. She knew the job was stressful and officers faced high-pressure situations every day, but there needed to be a process to prevent mistakes like this from happening. After she filed her report, she received a message from the senior officer. He thanked her for understanding and let her know they were already discussing ways to improve their training to prevent similar issues in the future. This gave her a sense of hope. It felt good to know that, instead of brushing off her concerns, they were actually considering changes. This experience hadn't been easy, but she felt like it had made an impact. It reminded her that sometimes difficult moments are necessary to bring about real change. And in this case, maybe it would help strengthen the trust and respect among all the officers who worked so hard to keep their communities safe. In the days following the incident, the FBI agent tried to push the experience out of her mind, but it lingered. She had thought the misunderstanding would be a one-time issue, just a frustrating mix-up that was resolved. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how easily it could have gone differently, and that started to bother her. Every day, she worked with people from different agencies, from local police to other federal departments. Normally, they had a shared understanding and respect for each other's roles, which made cooperation smooth and effective. But her recent encounter had shown her a gap she hadn't noticed before. A lack of awareness, maybe even trust, between agencies. And if this gap was big enough for her, an experienced agent, to get tangled up in, then it could be affecting other interactions too. This thought weighed on her, because she understood that teamwork and communication were key to everyone's safety. One afternoon, she received a call from her supervisor, who had seen the report she'd filed. He was a calm, practical person who usually didn't worry too much about small issues, but he could tell this had been a challenging situation. He thanked her for handling it professionally and then asked if she would be interested in helping address the matter further. At first, she wasn't sure what he meant, but then he explained that the department was looking into a joint workshop where agents like her and local officers could discuss best practices and ways to strengthen interagency cooperation. He felt her perspective would be valuable in guiding the session. The agent paused, thinking about what he was asking. Speaking to a room full of officers, some of whom might still be wary of federal agents, wasn't exactly what she had in mind. Yet, she also knew this was a chance to make a real difference. If sharing her experience could prevent others from facing a similar situation, it might be worth the discomfort. She agreed, and they began to plan the workshop together. On the day of the workshop, she felt a bit nervous. As she walked into the room, she saw officers and agents from several departments gathered around tables. Some were talking quietly, while others just glanced at her, curious but reserved. When the session started, she stood at the front, sharing a bit about her own work and how much she respected local officers. She could tell they were listening closely, some nodding in agreement. Then, she shared the story of the recent traffic stop. As she explained the confusion and tension that arose simply because of a miscommunication, she saw their expressions change. Some looked surprised, others a bit embarrassed, as they recognized how easily the situation had escalated. After she finished, a few officers raised their hands to ask questions. They talked about how difficult it could be to judge situations on the spot, especially when they felt under pressure. The agent understood this, acknowledging that their job wasn't easy and that things could move quickly in the field. She emphasized that clear communication and respect between agencies were essential, especially in those tense moments. By the end of the workshop, she could sense a shift in the room. What started as a hesitant, almost awkward gathering was turning into an open discussion. Officers shared their thoughts, and agents talked about their own experiences working with local departments. It became clear that many of them had faced similar issues, just on a smaller scale. They talked about how they could support each other better, agreeing that no one should feel out of place or mistrusted simply because they worked for a different agency. When the workshop wrapped up, several officers came up to thank her, saying they hadn't realized how much their actions could impact others. The agent left feeling hopeful. She knew one workshop wouldn't change everything overnight, but it felt like a step forward. For her, it was a reminder that sometimes, even a frustrating experience could lead to a positive change that would benefit everyone in the end. After the workshop, the agent returned to her routine work, hoping the session would make a lasting impact. A few weeks went by, and she noticed that something had changed in her interactions with local police officers. They were friendlier and more respectful, even in small ways. Whenever she entered a local police station or showed her badge on duty, she sensed a shift, a level of trust that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, she was called to assist on a case involving a series of burglaries that had crossed city and county lines. The case required close cooperation between local police and the FBI, so she was asked to join a meeting at the police station. When she arrived, she found herself sitting alongside several officers she hadn't met before. As they introduced themselves, she could tell some of them were curious about her background and her role. The lead officer, who had attended the workshop, began the briefing by openly recognizing the importance of working closely with federal agents on cases like this. His tone was respectful, and he made sure everyone in the room understood that they were all on the same team. As the meeting went on, the agent noticed that the officers were not only listening carefully, but also asking her questions about the FBI's resources and how they could use them to solve the case faster. She could feel a genuine interest in learning how to work together effectively. During a break in the meeting, one of the younger officers came up to her. He hesitated for a moment, then thanked her for sharing her story at the workshop. He admitted that he had been nervous about working with federal agents, feeling that they were sometimes too official and difficult to approach. He explained that hearing her experience had given him a new perspective. It helped him see federal agents as colleagues, not just outsiders stepping into local affairs. She appreciated his honesty and told him that building trust worked both ways. It wasn't just about titles or agencies, but about understanding each other's roles and respecting the unique challenges everyone faced. As they returned to the meeting, the agent felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: a genuine sense of partnership. She no longer felt like she had to prove herself or explain her presence. Instead, they were all working side by side, each person adding their own expertise and strengths to the case. The atmosphere was cooperative, not competitive, and everyone seemed focused on the same goal: solving the case as a united team. Over the next few days, they made significant progress. With the FBI's technology and resources, they were able to trace the burglars' movements and uncover important clues. The local officers, who had detailed knowledge of the community, filled in gaps the FBI might have missed. Together, they made connections faster and more effectively than either group could have done alone. The agent felt proud, not just of the case's progress, but of how smoothly everyone was working together. On the day they finally caught the main suspect, the whole team gathered to celebrate the breakthrough. There were high fives, relieved smiles, and a real sense of achievement. The agent realized that this wasn't just a win for the case. It was proof that the workshop had left a real impact. They had gone from working as strangers to functioning as a solid team. Before she left, the lead officer pulled her aside. He thanked her again for being open about her past experience and helping them all see things from a different perspective. "I think we all learned something from that workshop," he said, shaking her hand with respect. "We're lucky to have you on the team." As she drove home that evening, the agent reflected on how much had changed. What began as a frustrating incident had grown into something much bigger. It hadn't just changed her relationship with the local police. It had shown everyone involved that they were stronger when they worked together. For the first time in her career, she felt like the lines between local and federal had blurred in the best way possible. And that was a lesson she knew would stick with her, and with the officers, for a long time to come. A few weeks after closing the burglary case together, the agent had settled back into her usual work routine. Things felt smooth, and she noticed that every interaction with local officers was easier now, more natural. Even when she wasn't officially on a case, she'd get friendly nods or a quick wave from officers who'd seen her at the workshop. It felt good, like she'd finally become part of the community she worked so hard to protect. Then, one evening, she got a call that surprised her. It was from the same senior officer who had apologized to her on the night she was pulled over. He sounded friendly, maybe even a bit eager, and asked if she'd be interested in joining a special community event at the local station. It was an open house night for people in the area to meet their local officers, learn about their work, and ask questions. He explained that a few federal agents would also be attending to show the community how local and federal forces work together. They wanted to highlight the teamwork and trust they've been building, and he thought she'd be the perfect person to represent the FBI side. At first, she hesitated. Public events weren't exactly her strong suit. She was more comfortable working cases than chatting with strangers or answering random questions. But then she thought about how much things had changed since that night she'd been pulled over. She realized this could be a chance to keep building those bridges, not just between agencies, but with the community itself. So she agreed, and they made a plan for her to give a short talk and then stay to answer questions. On the evening of the event, she arrived at the station early. The lobby had been transformed with tables, displays, and equipment that the public could check out. Local officers were setting up, looking relaxed as they laughed and talked. When she walked in, a few officers waved her over, introducing her to others who would be part of the event. She felt welcomed, and that made her relax a bit too. As people from the community started to arrive, she saw a mix of families, teenagers, and even some older residents. Kids looked wide-eyed at the police cars parked out front, and parents seemed interested in understanding what really went on behind the scenes. When it was time for her talk, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the front. She began by telling them about her role and how she'd ended up in their town. She spoke about the importance of keeping the community safe and how it wasn't something any single person or agency could do alone. She then shared a lighter version of her story about being pulled over and how that experience had turned into something positive. People chuckled, and she could feel the room warming up to her. She explained how the workshop had changed things for everyone involved, and how much she respected the officers she'd met since then. The crowd listened closely, some people nodding as she spoke. She could see they appreciated knowing there were real people like her and the officers, working together to protect them. After her talk, people came up with questions. A young boy asked her if she ever caught a real bad guy, and she smiled, explaining that sometimes the biggest victories came from teamwork, not just a single arrest. An older woman thanked her for taking the time to be there, saying she felt reassured knowing the police and FBI were working so closely. The senior officer who'd invited her over watched from a distance, giving her a thumbs up whenever they made eye contact. She could tell he was proud of how far things had come. As the night wound down, a group of officers and community members gathered to take photos. She stood with them, smiling for the cameras, feeling a genuine sense of pride and belonging. When she finally left the station that night, she realized just how important that small decision to join the open house had been. This wasn't just about clearing up misunderstandings or building respect with the local officers. It was about showing the community they served that they were united in their mission. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a shared purpose, something everyone could feel a part of. As she drove home, she felt a sense of accomplishment and gratitude. She had come into this town as an outsider, but now she felt like she truly belonged. And that, she thought, was perhaps one of the most meaningful outcomes of all. A few weeks after the community open house, the agent was feeling more connected than ever to her town. She no longer felt like an outsider, but rather part of a team that stretched beyond just her own FBI role. As she settled back into her work routine, her phone rang with an unexpected call from a familiar voice, the same senior officer who had invited her to the open house. He sounded serious, telling her there was a case that might need her expertise. A string of break-ins had been reported in a small neighborhood on the town's outskirts, and local officers suspected that it was more than just random burglaries. The officer explained that the pattern looked organized, maybe even part of a larger ring. Normally, local police would handle cases like these, but they hit a wall. The thieves were slick, leaving no clear evidence behind, and it seemed like they knew exactly when to strike, avoiding security cameras and leaving little trace. The agent listened carefully, her mind already racing through possibilities. She agreed to meet the officers at their station the next day to discuss details and see how the FBI could support them. When she arrived, she was greeted with familiar faces, and a few of the officers nodded or smiled, recognizing her from the open house. The atmosphere was serious but comfortable, a reminder of how far they'd come in building trust and respect. As they began discussing the case, the agent reviewed the evidence they had so far. It was clear the thieves knew the area well and had planned each break-in carefully. The agent suggested they start by looking at the patterns in a broader way, using some of the technology available to the FBI. With the right data, they could analyze not just when and where the burglaries happened, but also cross-reference it with other activity in the region. This approach could help them identify any unusual patterns or connections to past cases. The officers seemed impressed, and they quickly set up a small task force, including the agent, a few detectives, and officers familiar with the neighborhoods. They split up the work, with the agent focusing on the data side, while the officers gathered information on potential suspects. Over the next few days, they all worked closely, sharing insights and adjusting their strategy as they uncovered new details. The team dynamic was strong, and the agent was glad to see the officers embracing the idea of combining local knowledge with federal resources. As they dug deeper, the team discovered a few clues that hinted at a larger network. A certain type of van had been spotted near two of the break-in locations, and further digging revealed that this van had been rented using fake IDs. The agent suggested tracing the rental records to see if similar vans had been rented in nearby towns. The officers immediately took action, and within hours, they had a promising lead. Another town reported a string of burglaries with a similar pattern and the same type of rented van. With this information, the team decided to coordinate with law enforcement in the neighboring towns. It felt like a breakthrough. They arranged a stakeout for the area where the thieves were most likely to strike next, based on their pattern. It was late at night, and the team sat in their cars, radios crackling softly as they waited. The agents sat alongside one of the officers, and they chatted quietly, sharing stories about their work and even a few jokes to pass the time. Then, just past midnight, a van fitting the description pulled into the neighborhood. The team watched as two people stepped out, looking around cautiously. The agent and the officer exchanged a look and nodded. They called it in and quickly moved to surround the suspects, giving them no chance to escape. The operation was smooth and coordinated, the result of all their planning and teamwork. Within minutes, they had the suspects in custody, along with evidence linking them to the other break-ins. As the night wrapped up, the agent felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just because they'd caught the suspects, but because they had done it together, seamlessly blending local knowledge and federal support. The officers thanked her, expressing how grateful they were for her help and for the FBI's resources, which had made all the difference in solving the case. Driving home that night, the agent couldn't help but smile. She'd come to this town as just another outsider on duty, but now she felt like she'd made a real difference, not only by catching criminals, but by strengthening the bond between local and federal forces. This, she thought, was why she had joined law enforcement in the first place, to be part of something bigger, to protect communities, and to work side by side with people who shared the same dedication and values. In the days following the successful stakeout, the atmosphere at the station was charged with a new level of excitement. The officers were talking about the recent case, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and pride. The agent noticed that people who had once been reserved around her now stopped to chat or asked her advice on smaller cases. She'd earned their respect, not just as an FBI agent, but as someone they could count on. One morning, while going over some reports at her desk, the agent received a call from the chief of the police department. He thanked her for her role in solving the case, then added that he had a special request. The local department was considering organizing a training program for officers from surrounding areas, focusing on teamwork, communication, and using technology more effectively in investigations. The chief asked if she'd be interested in leading a few sessions, given her recent success with the joint operation. The idea of leading a training program was unexpected, but the agent could see how valuable it could be. After all, she'd witnessed firsthand the difference that open communication and cooperation could make in law enforcement. Agreeing to the proposal, she and the chief started planning the sessions, aiming to cover practical strategies that would help local officers feel comfortable collaborating with different agencies. When the training program began, officers from nearby towns gathered at the station. Some looked skeptical, while others seemed genuinely curious. The agent opened with a simple statement, sharing her belief that safety was a shared responsibility, and the more they worked together, the better they could protect their communities. She shared stories from her own experiences, moments when communication or a different perspective had been the key to solving a case. One of the sessions focused on how to use technology in investigations. The agent demonstrated how data analysis tools could help spot patterns that might not be visible at first glance. She kept her explanations simple, showing examples of how they'd used technology to track the rental van in the recent case. The officers listened closely, some even jotting down notes, realizing that these tools could make a difference in their own work. In another session, the focus was on communication. The agent emphasized the importance of clear, respectful communication, especially during tense situations. She explained that misunderstandings could easily lead to mistrust, which was something they couldn't afford. One officer raised his hand and shared a story about a time when a lack of communication had led to a missed opportunity in a case. Others nodded, realizing they had similar experiences. It became a moment of connection, as everyone recognized the need to improve how they worked with others. The final session was more hands-on. The agent led them through a mock investigation, encouraging them to apply everything they'd learned. They split into teams, each team assigned different tasks that required collaboration and communication. Watching them, the agent felt a sense of pride. Here were officers who had initially seemed unsure or even hesitant, now working side by side, sharing information, and using the tools she'd introduced to solve the case together. At the end of the training program, the chief stood up to thank her in front of everyone. He spoke about how the sessions had opened their eyes to new ways of working together, and how her guidance had helped bridge the gap between local and federal agencies. One by one, the officers came up to shake her hand, expressing gratitude for what they'd learned. As the agent left the station that day, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. She'd come into the town as a stranger and had been met with hesitation and even doubt. But now, she was leaving behind something meaningful. A stronger, more connected team of officers who understood that they could accomplish so much more together than they ever could alone. She knew this training would ripple out, making each community safer and more united. It was a quiet, powerful victory, and it was exactly why she had joined the FBI in the first place. Following the training program, the agent thought her work in the town would settle back into routine tasks. She had helped bring a case to a close, led a successful workshop, and earned the respect of local officers. However, the impact of her work turned out to be greater than she anticipated. A few weeks later, she received a call from a nearby county's police department. The officer on the line explained that they'd heard about her recent collaboration and training with the local police and wanted to see if she could bring her expertise to their team as well. Curious but unsure of what to expect, she agreed to meet them. When she arrived, she was greeted warmly, with the officers eager to learn from her approach. The county had been facing a challenging case involving organized theft, much like the one she'd helped solve before. They were struggling with limited resources and felt that having a fresh perspective might help them make headway. After sitting down with the officers and listening to the details of the case, the agent suggested that they tackle it in a way similar to the last one, focusing on open communication and pooling resources effectively. She emphasized the importance of small steps, encouraging each department to share information openly, no matter how minor it seemed. They set up a system where updates on suspects, evidence, and case developments could be shared in real time, giving each officer access to the full picture. To their surprise, small details that had once seemed unrelated started connecting. Surveillance footage from one town matched witness reports from another, and this pattern helped them map out the suspect's movements across counties. With each piece of information, the officers could predict the suspect's next possible targets, allowing them to stay one step ahead. The teamwork was working, and morale was high as they realized the power of their collaboration. One evening, the agent joined them on a stakeout, just like she had with her own team. They were tracking a group suspected of planning another theft, based on the connections they'd uncovered together. As they waited quietly in the surveillance van, the agent felt a sense of camaraderie with these officers, much like she had back at her own station. They were all in it together, alert and ready, each person knowing their role in the operation. When the suspects arrived, the team coordinated their moves precisely, closing in and arresting them without incident. It was a flawless operation, and everyone felt the pride of knowing they'd played a part in it. Afterward, back at the station, the officers were in high spirits, expressing their gratitude to the agent. They admitted that before working with her, they hadn't realized how effective a combined effort could be. They'd been used to handling things in their own ways, but now they saw the advantages of a wider approach. The agent smiled, feeling genuinely grateful for the chance to help another team grow closer and work better. The success of this case led to even more attention. Word began spreading among nearby departments about the agent's collaborative approach and the results it was bringing. Calls started coming in from other places, each one asking for guidance or support. The agent realized she'd had started something much bigger than she'd intended. She had shown these officers that the power of teamwork didn't just stop at the city or county line. It could stretch as far as they were willing to go. As she drove back to her town that night, the agent reflected on how much things had changed since that first, frustrating night she was pulled over. What had started as a moment of misunderstanding had grown into something deeply impactful. She had gone from feeling like an outsider to becoming a bridge between different teams, encouraging trust and cooperation wherever she went. The agent knew her role was shifting in a way she hadn't expected. She was no longer just an FBI agent assigned to her own cases. She was now someone others looked to for support, guidance, and connection. This newfound responsibility felt both exciting and humbling, but most of all, it reminded her of why she joined law enforcement in the first place: to make a difference, not just in solving cases, but in building a culture of unity and respect among those who served. Her work had grown beyond a single town or single team, and she was ready to embrace it. As she looked out at the dark road ahead, she felt certain that she was on the right path, leading her to places she hadn't expected, but that felt right all the same. And that, she thought, was a journey worth continuing. As the weeks passed, The agent continued to receive calls from various police departments seeking her help. Each new request was an opportunity to share what she had learned and to strengthen bonds between agencies. It was exciting for her, knowing she could make a real difference in law enforcement. She started planning her schedule around these sessions, moving from town to town, sharing her experiences, and learning from each group she worked with. One day, she received a call from a department that was struggling with a significant increase in drug-related crimes. The officers explained that they felt overwhelmed and unsure of how to tackle the growing issue. They wanted to set up a meeting to discuss possible strategies and how the FBI could assist. Listening to their concerns, the agent felt a sense of urgency and was eager to help. When she arrived at the department, she could sense the stress in the room. Officers were busy discussing their cases, and the tension was palpable. The agent introduced herself and began the meeting by acknowledging the tough situation they were facing. She shared that she understood the challenges they had with drug-related crimes. It was important to her to create a space where the officers felt comfortable discussing their concerns and experiences. As the conversation unfolded, the officers opened up about their struggles. They talked about the difficulties of gathering evidence and the frustration of seeing the same suspects being released over and over. The agent listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. She reminded them that they weren't alone in this fight, and that collaboration could help them face these challenges more effectively. The agent then proposed a two-pronged approach. First, they could focus on gathering intelligence about the drug trade in their area, sharing information about known dealers and patterns of activity. Second, she suggested they create community outreach programs to educate residents about the dangers of drug abuse and how they could help law enforcement. This approach would not only strengthen their case, but also build trust within the community. The officers were enthusiastic about the idea of involving the community. They recognized that many residents were eager to help, but often didn't know how to get involved. Together, they brainstormed ways to reach out, such as hosting informational sessions at local schools and community centers. They could share resources and create an open dialogue about the issue, making it clear that everyone had a role to play. Over the next few weeks, the agent worked closely with the officers to implement their new strategies. They organized community meetings where residents could come to learn and ask questions. The agent helped them prepare informative materials, focusing on prevention, available resources, and how to report suspicious activities. As the first meeting approached, the officers were nervous but excited, eager to see how the community would respond. On the day of the event, the turnout was impressive. Families, teachers, and local business owners filled the community center, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and concern. The agent opened the session, speaking about the importance of community involvement in tackling drug-related issues. She shared stories from other towns that had successfully created outreach programs, emphasizing that change was possible when everyone worked together. The officers took turns presenting, sharing statistics and personal stories about their experiences with drug crimes. The more they spoke, the more the audience leaned in, engaged and interested. Questions began to flow, and the officers answered each one, establishing a connection with the residents. It was a powerful moment as they realized that people genuinely cared about the safety of their community and wanted to help. As the meeting wrapped up, many residents approached the officers to express their support. They offered ideas for more community events and even volunteered to help spread the word. The agent felt a sense of pride watching the officers build those connections. The community was coming together, and it felt like a real turning point in their fight against drug-related crime. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the police department shifted. Officers seemed more motivated and hopeful. They received tips from community members, which led to breakthroughs in their cases. The agent continued to support them, providing additional resources and guidance as needed. She realized that the real impact was not just in solving individual cases, but in changing the culture of the department and the community as a whole.